This video is brought to you by Devout Decals, makers of reusable Catholic art for your home altar, your bedroom, and your home classroom.
The Synod on Synodality is ongoing and will be, on paper, until near the end of October. And then next year we will have more Synod on Synodality coverage because there will be 10 working groups doing their diabolical work leading up into June when they'll finally issue their final reports, and in theory, Pope Francis will issue his rulings on whatever it is they have to say. But the synodal process is exposing hypocrisy on a lot of levels. I recently reported to you how there are American, mostly women who are advocates for the ordination of deaconesses who are very upset that Cardinal Fernandez said no again to this, even if he did so in an ambiguous way that leaves the door open for a future pope to find and invent some method that doesn't actually undermine the church's magisterial authority entirely to ordain deaconesses. The synodal process is exposing this hypocrisy not just among the usual suspects, though. It's also exposing the hypocrisy of the entire hierarchy that are playing along with this nutty job, but also among some that people look to for solid leadership. And I'm here talking about the African bishops. And I'll get to them in a moment, because there's an underlying thinking that really needs to be exposed, and that underlying thinking is grievance. The entire Synod of Synodality and the push for changing church teaching comes from a place of grievance and relativism. Grievance because you have this argument that the church has gotten it wrong and treated people very badly for all of its history. And relativism because you have this argument being made in Africa that because the culture is there, the sacrament of holy matrimony should be treated completely different, which is not that different than the argument James Martin is making when the culture of the West is much more open to the James Martin sin and the people associated with it, and thus the church needs to change its teaching about that to get with the times. At the end of the day, this is all a get with the times argument, because the church is doing an injustice to people by clinging rigidly to the same teachings it has taught, going back to antiquity. That is what's core here, and you're going to see that play out in these stories I have for you today. So we go to Catholic World Report for this headline. The liberal and flawed roots of tiresome synodal grievances. Too many synodal enthusiasts are proceeding with the concept of the church as a joyless landscape of oppressive structures and teachings that must be replaced with something more in keeping with the praxis of secular liberalism. Where's the lie? That article is written by Larry Chapp. I'll have a bit of a lengthy quote for you here in a second to give you an idea of his argument. Everything he has to say there is on the money. But this is an attempt to retool the church's teachings on morality to take and move away from the unpopular positions the church takes in the modern world to align it with a more conservative expression of them. If you don't believe me, this has been going on since basically the beginning. Amoris Laetitia was the first real sign of this, with Holy Communion being authorized for the divorced and civilly remarried, with the Vatican saying the interpretation of the Argentine bishops, among them then Archbishop Manuel Fernandez, that was the correct interpretation. Now, a lot of dioceses in the West have not interpreted it that way and so far have gotten away with it, but that interpretation has opened the door for fiducia supplicans and the playing fast and loose with the James Martin sin. And so we have all of that here now. It's an attempt to essentially embrace a very particular worldview of morality from the secular world. And here's what Larry Chapp has to say, quote, "Left unarticulated and largely ignored in this avalanche of newspeak verbiage is just how expressive the Catholic iteration of liberal modernity is to the central thesis that animates all of the variegated versions of modernity. This is what I call the teleology of transgression, wherein all that came before, via the pathways of culture and tradition, are recast as oppressive restrictions on our freedom, from which we now need to liberate ourselves. Thus, all that came before, especially in the moral, spiritual, and religious domain, must be erased entirely if one is a pure secularist, or must be simply redefined and reshaped if one wishes to retain some religious identity, in order to conform to the new ordo of liberative transgression. We saw this entire transgressive dynamic once again on display this past week when one of the extra synodal committees established by Pope Francis to look at various hot-button issues in the Church issued a preliminary report on its proceedings, just as the Synod on Synodality was beginning. Once again, the report of Jonathan Lytle at the National Catholic Register has brought this to our attention and helped us to connect the dots. As Lytle notes, the committee reports that going forward moral theology must be reformed in a manner that moves away from concepts of moral absolutes and the objective truths of certain moral laws, and towards a, quote, new paradigm that focuses instead on subjective dispositions and the vagaries of experience and individuated circumstances. Lytle quotes the press release as follows: "Ethically speaking, it is not a matter of applying prepackaged objective truth to the different subjective situations as if they were mere particular cases of an immutable and universal law. The criteria of discernment arises from listening to the living self-gift of revelation in Jesus in the today of the Spirit." Even beyond the cringe-inducing use of the phrase, "in the today of the Spirit," this is paradigmatic expression of the moral theory known as proportionalism, and it stands in direct line of opposition to the teaching of Pope John Paul II and Veritatis Splendor, not to mention the entirety of the Catholic natural law moral tradition, both of which do indeed speak of moral absolutes and of the binding nature of moral truth on our consciences. And as an expression of opposition to what has come before in the traditions, a before it clearly seeks to erase and transgress, it is a foundationally un-Catholic stance vis-a-vis the normality of revelation as expressed in Scripture and tradition. Revelation itself now becomes part of the oppressive past, insofar as it gives us a preset pattern of answers that illegitimately imposes itself on our idiosyncratic freedom, and must be recast instead as part of the plasticity of historicity and subjectivity. And of course, if one opposes such proposals, one is accused of, quote, opposing needed reforms, as if reform can only go in the direction of liberal modernity. We see this posture as well in the various reactions to the report from the committee devoted to the issue of ordaining women to the diaconate. Cardinal Fernandez, in issuing that report, made it clear that the stance of Pope Francis is that ordaining women to the sacramental diaconate is not going to happen. But on cue, this elicited the usual condemnations that it represents yet another insult to women, and that it will perpetuate the ongoing disenfranchisement of women, as well as their marginalization in the Church as second-class citizens. End lengthy quote. I know, it's a long quote, but it sets us up for this story, because everything he said there applies to the nonsense the African bishops gave. I'm going to remind you, the African bishops correctly opposed fiducia supplicans, and people took that as a sign that the African bishops are going to be the saviors of the Church. I'm sorry, that's not true, as you're going to see here, because the African bishops have shown that they are no better than the modernists in the rest of the Western Church. They have made an argument that because of the cultures of their countries, Catholic teaching on the nature and reality of the sacrament of holy matrimony shouldn't apply to them, and they're now asking for the Church to help them figure out how to apply these standards to the frankly really corrupted cultures of where they come from. So headline from cath.net. African bishops seek guidelines for dealing with multi-partner marriages. Yes, they want a man to be able to have as many brides as he likes, because that's how it's done in some places in the continent. There's an easy answer to what you're about to hear here, and I'm going to give it to you after you hear what they have to say from the cardinals themselves, including a name that you might be familiar with because it's the same cardinal who opposed fiducia supplicans, even though fiducia supplicans is argued on the same grounds that they are arguing here about multi-partner marriages and the sacrament of holy matrimony. Quote, the Catholic bishops of Africa are still looking for an answer to the question of how they should deal with Catholics who live in multi-partner matrimonial situations. The chairman of the Pan-African Bishops' Council, Fridolin Cardinal Abongo, reported on these discussions via video recording at the opening session of the World Synod in Rome on Wednesday. In the report, which was shown at the World Synod meeting, the Archbishop of Kinshasa explained that the phenomenon is, quote, a real challenge for pastoral care and is very complex. In addition to traditional forms, there are also modern forms of non-monogamous cohabitation and concubinage, i.e. marriage-like cohabitation without a marriage certificate. The Church must grapple with how it deals with baptized Catholics who live in this way, but also with the fact that people who live in these relationships want to be baptized. The key question is what the appropriate pastoral response is for the people concerned. Due to the complexity of the issue, Mbongo believes that further research and consultations are necessary, before guidelines can be issued at the level of the Pan-African Bishops' Council. The Vatican Dicastery for the Doctrine of the Faith will also be involved in these consultations next year." End quote. So, Cardinal Fernandez, author of Fiducia Supplicans, which at the beginning of the document paid lip service to Catholic teaching on the James Martin sin, and then authorized the entire church to ignore Catholic teaching on the James Martin sin, because if you read the document, it absolutely does do that, is going to help them deal with this issue. Now, I have a novel way to address this. It's not going to make people happy, but here's a novel way to address it. Deny anybody in that situation the sacraments until they comply. Tough love. That's all you have to do. Same with Catholic politicians or their wives who claim to be Catholic and support the sacrifice to Moloch and are very public about it. Even if you support them and hope that they win their relative contests and they would be a much better choice than the other side of things, still, if they come out in support of these things, deny them communion until they comply. If they leave no doubt about their stance on that issue, deny them the Eucharist until they repent of it. That is how the church works. The Church of Nice needs to be banished, and the Catholic Church needs to be restored to its full glory, including on how it addresses these tough, thorny moral issues. It isn't as hard as they make it sound out to be. They just don't want to do their jobs. Now, what I just said there at the end may be kind of unpopular with some people. That's fine. But let me know what you think of all this in the comments. Do you think maybe they should be denied the sacraments, but not handled so publicly? Privately taken aside, especially if they're a public figure? Do you think the African bishops should spend all this time studying the question when the answer is right in front of their face? Let me know what you think about this in the comments, please. Hit like and subscribe if you haven't. It does help, so does sharing this on social media. That helps too. And as always, pray for the church. I'm Anthony Stine. Ave Maria.